I'm Emma, and I want to tell you about the day my ex-husband's new wife tried to humiliate me in front of 200 guests, only to watch me walk away with something she could never buy. What started as the most dreaded invitation of my life ended with photographers chasing me down in a parking lot, begging to know the story behind my dress. Sometimes the universe has the most poetic sense of timing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Cream cardstock with gold embossing that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Ryan Christopher Martinez and Brittany Nicole Ashworth request your presence at their union. I stared at it for a full minute, wondering why my ex-husband of 2 years would invite me to watch him marry the woman he'd been seeing while we were still together. The answer came in a text an hour later from his mother, Margaret, who I'd always adored. She explained that Brittany had insisted I be invited because she wanted to show there were no hard feelings, that she was mature enough to include Ryan's entire past in their celebration. Even through the phone screen, I could hear the diplomatic way Margaret phrased it, but I understood the subtext. Brittany wanted me there to parade her victory. I'm 31, a freelance graphic designer who works from a converted garage studio behind the small craftsman house I rent in Southeast Portland. My world is vintage furniture rescued from estate sales, plants that somehow thrive despite my erratic watering schedule, and the constant hum of creativity that keeps me awake until 3 a.m. Ryan used to complain that I never looked put together enough for his corporate events, that my artistic sensibilities embarrassed him in front of his finance colleagues. When he left, he said he needed someone who understood his ambitions, someone who fit better into the life he was building. 3 months later, Brittany appeared on his Instagram, blonde and polished, wearing clothes that cost more than most people's rent. The wedding was set for early June at the Riverside Country Club, the kind of old money establishment where memberships pass through generations, and the parking lot looks like a luxury car showcase. I knew Brittany's family owned half the commercial real estate in the Pearl District, and this wedding was clearly their chance to display that wealth. For weeks, I debated whether to attend. My sister Lisa thought I was insane for even considering it. Why put yourself through that torture? She kept asking. But something stubborn in me refused to hide. I had nothing to be ashamed of. Ryan had made his choice, and I'd spent 2 years rebuilding my life into something I actually loved. The dress came to me by accident, the way the best things often do. I was browsing an estate sale in the Hawthorne district, looking for vintage frames for my studio, when I saw it hanging in the back bedroom of a 1920s bungalow. Cream silk with the most delicate beadwork I'd ever seen, tiny pearls and crystals, hand-sewn in an intricate pattern that caught light like scattered stars. The elderly woman running the sale told me it had belonged to her aunt, who'd worn it to parties in San Francisco during the 1960s. The woman had never had children, never found the right occasion to wear it again, and it had been carefully preserved, in tissue paper for decades. $25, the woman said, because she liked that I appreciated the craftsmanship. At home, I held it up to the window, watching afternoon light filter through the silk. It was gorgeous but too big, the shoulders too wide, the length pooling on my floor. Most people would have taken it to a tailor, but I'd been sewing since my grandmother taught me at age 12. I spent 3 evenings carefully taking it apart, studying how it was constructed, then rebuilding it to fit my body. I shortened the hemline to hit just below my knees, brought in the waist to follow my natural lines, and adjusted the neckline to be elegant but not overly revealing. When I finished, it looked like it had been made specifically for me. A perfect blend of vintage sophistication and modern fit. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, wearing the cream silk dress with my grandmother's pearl earrings and a simple pair of nude heels I'd owned for years. My dark hair fell in soft waves past my shoulders, and I'd kept my makeup natural but polished. I looked classic, timeless in a way that felt true to who I was. Lisa came over to drive with me, took one look, and whistled low. "You look incredible," she said, "like you stepped out of a movie from the 60s. I felt good, confident in a way I hadn't in years. This dress felt like armor made of silk and starlight. The Riverside Country Club sits on a bluff overlooking the Willamette River, all stone and timber architecture designed to look like it had been there for centuries rather than decades. Valets in white jackets directed cars up the winding drive, and I watched Teslas and BMWs disappear toward the parking area. Lisa squeezed my hand as we pulled up. "You sure about this?" she whispered. I nodded, though my stomach was doing complicated gymnastics. I'd made it this far. I wasn't backing down. Now. The ceremony was held in the garden. White chairs arranged in perfect rows facing an arch covered in white roses and trailing greenery. I found a seat toward the back, hoping to blend into the crowd, but I felt eyes on me the moment I sat down. Whispers followed, not malicious but curious. "Is that Emma? She looks amazing. What a beautiful dress." I kept my spine straight and my eyes forward, focusing on the string quartet playing softly near the rose arch. When the bridal party appeared, I had to admit Brittany looked stunning. Her dress was clearly designer, probably custom, with layers of ivory toll and intricate beadwork that must have taken months to complete. Her veil cascaded behind her like a waterfall, and her bouquet was an architectural masterpiece of white, orchids and trailing ribbons. Everything about her screamed expensive perfection, from her professionally styled hair to her manicured nails to her designer heels. She was beautiful in the way that money can create, polished and flawless and completely untouchable. Ryan looked handsome in his black tuxedo, his hair perfectly styled, his smile broad as he watched his bride walk down the aisle. I felt a small pang, not of loss but of recognition for who we'd both been when we were together. He looked happy, genuinely happy, and I found myself glad for him despite everything that had happened between us. People change, relationships end, and life moves forward. I'd learned to make peace with that truth. The ceremony was brief but elegant, filled with traditional vows and classical music. When they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause, and I clapped along, meaning it. Whatever Ryan and I had shared was finished, and whatever he and Brittany were building deserved its own chance to flourish. As guests began moving toward the clubhouse for cocktail hour, I hung back, letting the crowd thin before joining the reception. The cocktail hour was set up on the club's terrace, overlooking manicured gardens that rolled down toward the river. Servers in black uniforms circulated with champagne and elegant hors d'oeuvres, while a jazz trio played softly in the corner. I accepted a glass of champagne and found a quiet spot near the stone railing, watching boats move slowly along the water below. The afternoon sun was warm on my shoulders, and for a moment I felt genuinely peaceful. That peace lasted exactly 12 minutes until Brittany appeared beside me with two of her bridesmaids in tow. She'd changed from her ceremony dress into a shorter reception dress, still designer but more suitable for dancing. Her smile was bright and sharp as a blade as she approached. "Emma," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "I'm so glad you could make it. You look lovely." Her eyes traveled over my dress with the practiced assessment of someone who knew fashion, and I saw the exact moment she registered that it wasn't designer. "Where did you find that adorable little vintage piece?" she continued, her voice honeyed with false sweetness. "I thank you," I replied simply. "It's from an estate sale." I altered it myself. Her smile widened, and I realized this was exactly the opening she'd been hoping for. "How resourceful of you," she said, loud enough that conversations around us began to pause. "I love that you're so good at working with what you have. It must be nice not to worry about keeping up with current fashion." Her bridesmaids giggled, recognizing the carefully disguised insult for what it was. Other guests were definitely listening now, drawn by the tension in Brittany's voice and the theatrical way she was positioning herself. I felt heat rise in my cheeks but kept my expression neutral. I've always preferred classic styles, I said calmly. They tend to last longer than trends. Brittany's laugh was crystalline and cutting. Oh, absolutely, she agreed. Though I suppose when you're on a budget, durability is probably more important than style. Some of us are lucky enough not to have to choose. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Several guests looked away, embarrassed by Brittany's obvious attempt to humiliate me. Others watched with the fascination people have for social train wrecks, waiting to see how I would respond. I could feel my sister Lisa moving closer from across the terrace, ready to intervene if necessary. But something in me stayed perfectly calm, almost detached, as if I were watching this scene happen to someone else. I looked at Brittany, really looked at her, and saw something I recognized from my own past. The desperate need to prove worth through external validation. The fear that someone else's presence somehow diminished her own shine. She was beautiful and wealthy, and married to the man she wanted, but she still felt threatened enough by my existence to publicly try to shame me. It was sad, really, and I found I couldn't muster anger for someone so obviously insecure. That's a lovely way to think about it, I said quietly, my voice steady and warm. Your dress is absolutely gorgeous, by the way. You look radiant. Then, I smiled genuinely and turned back toward the river view. The compliment clearly wasn't what she'd expected, and for a moment, she seemed off balance. Her bridesmaids looked confused, unsure whether their cue was to continue the attack or retreat. The moment stretched uncomfortably until someone called Brittany's name from across the terrace, something about photographs, and she moved away with a brittle laugh and a final pointed look in my direction. Lisa appeared at my elbow immediately. "What the hell was that about?" she whispered furiously. I shook my head, still watching the river. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Just insecurity dressed up as confidence, I said. She's scared I represent something that threatens her narrative. Lisa looked like she wanted to march over and give Brittany a piece of her mind, but I caught her arm. "Let it go," I said. "This isn't worth the energy." But the encounter had shifted something in the atmosphere around me. Other guests approached throughout the cocktail hour, some to offer quiet support, others simply curious about the vintage dress that had sparked such a public moment. I found myself in several lovely conversations about fashion history, sustainable shopping, and the art of tailoring. A few women asked for my business card, interested in having vintage pieces altered to fit them. The attention was unexpected, but genuinely pleasant. A reminder that most people appreciate authenticity when they encounter it. Dinner was served in the club's main ballroom, a grand space with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. I was seated at a table with some of Ryan's college friends and their spouses, people I'd known during our marriage who greeted me warmly. The conversation flowed easily, focused on careers and travels, and shared memories that felt comfortable rather than awkward. I began to relax, thinking the worst of the evening was behind me. The speeches came with dessert, the usual parade of best man humor and maid of honor sentiment. Ryan's father spoke about welcoming Brittany to their family. Brittany's father talked about the joy of seeing his daughter find true love. Everything was perfectly appropriate and elegantly delivered, exactly what you'd expect at a wedding of this caliber. I applauded along with everyone else, genuinely moved by the obvious affection both families had for the couple. But then Brittany took the microphone for her own speech, which wasn't traditional but wasn't unheard of either. She thanked everyone for coming, spoke lovingly about Ryan, and expressed gratitude to both families for their support. It was all perfectly lovely until she got to what she called her closing thoughts. "Marriage," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system, "has taught me so much about the difference between what's real and what's just an imitation of the real thing." The words seemed innocent enough, but something in her tone made me look up from my dessert plate. She was scanning the room as she spoke, and when her eyes found mine, they lingered just a moment too long. "Some things," she continued, "might look beautiful on the surface, but they lack the substance, the authenticity, the genuine quality that comes from true value." Her smile was radiant as she raised her champagne glass. "Here's to recognizing the difference between what's precious and what's just pretending to be." The toast was met with enthusiastic applause, but I felt like I'd been slapped. The metaphor was transparent enough that several people at my table shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the dig for what it was. Lisa's face had gone stormy, and I put a gentle hand on her arm before she could react. "It's fine," I whispered. "Let her have this moment." But inside, I was struggling with a mix of hurt and disbelief. This was her wedding day, supposedly the happiest day of her life, and she was using it to take shots at her husband's ex-wife. It was petty and small, and exactly the kind of behavior that revealed more about her character than anything else. After dinner, as the dancing began, I decided it was time to leave. I'd fulfilled my obligation, shown that I could handle myself with grace, and proven that I wasn't intimidated by Brittany's attempts at humiliation. I said goodbye to my table mates, hugged a few of Ryan's family members who'd been kind to me, and made my way toward the exit. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of roses from the garden, and I felt a sense of relief as I walked toward the valet stand. That's when everything turned completely upside down. As I waited for the valet to bring Lisa's car around, I noticed a small commotion near the club's entrance. A group of well-dressed people with professional cameras were talking animatedly, with the wedding coordinator gesturing toward the ballroom. One of them, a woman with sharp silver hair and an elegantly cut black jacket, broke away from the group and walked directly toward me. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "I'm Isabella Marchetti from Vogue. We're here covering real wedding style for a feature on authentic American elegance, and I have to ask about your dress. It's absolutely extraordinary. Where did you find it?" I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "Vogue? Here?" The woman smiled at my obvious confusion. "We were invited by the club to photograph their events for a piece on Pacific Northwest style. But your dress caught my photographer's eye from across the room. The way you carry yourself, the impeccable fit, the vintage details. May I ask who designed it?" I felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life. "It's vintage," I managed to say. "From the 1960s. I found it at an estate sale and altered it myself." Isabella's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. "You altered this yourself? The fit is absolutely perfect. And the way you've styled it, so effortless and chic. Would you mind terribly if we took a few photographs? This is exactly the kind of authentic style we're looking for. Real women making beautiful choices that aren't about labels or price tags, but about understanding what works for their body and their life." Before I could fully process what was happening, Isabella had gestured to her photographer, a tall man with kind eyes who introduced himself as Marcus. They asked if I minded moving to the garden area where the light was better, and somehow I found myself following them, still clutching my small vintage purse and wondering if this was all an elaborate dream. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of gentle directions and camera clicks. Isabella asked about my background, my work as a graphic designer, my philosophy on personal style. I found myself talking about the joy of discovering unique pieces, the satisfaction of creating something new from something old, the way vintage fashion connected us to the women who'd worn these clothes decades before. Marcus was clearly talented, making me feel comfortable and natural rather than posed. He captured shots of me by the rose arch where the ceremony had been held, sitting on the stone wall overlooking the river, walking through the garden paths. Isabella kept murmuring appreciation, calling the dress a perfect example of sustainable luxury, and asking if I'd be interested in being featured in their upcoming piece on style innovators who were redefining American fashion. We were wrapping up the impromptu photo session when I heard voices behind us. I turned to see Brittany approaching with several wedding guests in tow, clearly drawn by the sight of professional photographers in her wedding venue. Her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something much sharper when she realized I was the subject of their attention. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice tight with barely concealed irritation. Isabella turned with professional courtesy. "Good evening. I'm Isabella Marchetti from Vogue. We're photographing your guest for a feature on authentic American style. Her dress is absolutely remarkable." Brittany's smile froze in place, and I watched her struggle to process this information. Vogue wanted to feature the cheap estate sale dress she'd publicly mocked just hours earlier. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. "How wonderful," Brittany managed to say, though her voice sounded strained. "I was just telling everyone earlier how unique Emma's fashion choices are. She's always been so creative with finding unusual pieces." Isabella nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the undercurrent of tension. "Exactly. This kind of authentic style is what we're celebrating. The ability to see beauty and potential where others might not, to create something extraordinary through vision and skill rather than just budget. It's much more interesting than simply buying designer pieces off the rack." The group of wedding guests stood in awkward silence, clearly picking up on the subtext but unsure how to respond. I felt a strange calm settle over me, not triumph exactly, but a quiet satisfaction that truth had a way of revealing itself. I hadn't sought this validation, hadn't needed it to feel good about my choices, but there was something deeply satisfying about watching Brittany realize that her public attempt to shame me had backfired spectacularly. Marcus finished taking his final shots and began packing his equipment. Isabella handed me her business card and asked if I'd be available for a follow-up interview once they began editing the piece. "We'll want to include your story about finding and altering the dress," she explained. "It's exactly the kind of narrative that resonates with our readers. Women who create their own style, rather than following what they're told to buy." As the Vogue team prepared to leave, they thanked Brittany for allowing them to use her wedding venue for the photographs. She nodded stiffly, clearly still processing the unexpected turn of events. "I'm sure your wedding photos will be beautiful as well," Isabella said graciously before walking away with her team. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken irony. I realized this was my moment to exit gracefully, while the universe's sense of humor was still echoing through the evening air. I said goodbye to the group, wished Brittany congratulations once more on her beautiful wedding, and walked toward the valet stand where Lisa's car was finally waiting. As I slid into the passenger seat, I could see Brittany still standing in the garden, surrounded by her guests, but looking somehow diminished in her expensive designer dress. The drive home passed in relative quiet. Lisa kept shaking her head and muttering about karma and poetic justice. But I found myself thinking about something Isabella had said about creating your own style rather than following what you're told to buy. It applied to more than just fashion. It applied to life, to the choices we make about who to be and how to move through the world. 3 weeks later, the Vogue feature was published online with the title, "The New American Elegance: Style Innovators, Redefining Luxury." My photograph appeared alongside several other women from across the country, all of whom had been featured for their unique approach to personal style. The article described my dress as a masterclass in sustainable luxury and quoted me talking about the joy of giving new life to vintage pieces. They included the story of finding the dress at an estate sale and altering it myself, framing it as an example of creativity triumphing over commerce. The response was overwhelming. My Instagram followers grew by thousands overnight. I received inquiries from women all over the country asking about vintage alterations and styling consultations. Several fashion blogs reached out for interviews, and a local boutique asked if I'd be interested in teaching workshops on vintage restoration. Most surprisingly, I got a call from a documentary filmmaker who was working on a project about sustainable fashion and wanted to include my story. Ryan texted me a few days after the article was published. Saw the Vogue piece. Congratulations. You look beautiful, and you deserve the recognition. It was kind and mature, exactly the sort of closure our relationship had needed. I texted back a simple thank you and meant it. We'd both moved on to lives that suited us better, and that was worth celebrating. I never heard directly from Brittany about the article, but I noticed that she'd unfollowed me on social media and blocked me from seeing her posts. I wasn't surprised. It had to sting, realizing that her attempt to publicly humiliate someone had instead launched them into a moment of genuine recognition. But I found I couldn't hold on to any anger about her behavior. She'd been operating from a place of insecurity and fear, and those emotions make people do things they're not proud of. The vintage dress now hangs in my closet with a dry cleaning tag from the professional care I had done after the photo shoot. I've worn it twice since then, once to a gallery opening and once to dinner with friends, and each time I put it on, I remember the lesson it taught me. Real elegance isn't about price tags or designer labels. It's about knowing who you are and having the confidence to express that authentically, regardless of what other people think you should be wearing or buying or doing. Sometimes I think about that evening at the Riverside Country Club, about how differently it could have gone if I'd chosen to respond to Brittany's provocations with anger instead of grace. If I'd escalated the conflict, argued back, tried to defend myself publicly, the whole tone of the evening would have shifted. The Vogue photographers might never have noticed me, or if they had, they would have seen someone embroiled in petty drama rather than someone comfortable in her own skin. There's power in choosing not to engage with behavior that's designed to diminish you. There's strength in letting your authentic self speak louder than someone else's insecurities. And sometimes, when you focus on being true to who you are rather than defending against who others think you should be, the universe has a way of validating that choice in the most unexpected ways. The cream silk dress taught me that vintage things aren't valuable because they're old, but because they've survived. They've been cared for, preserved, and given new life by people who recognized their worth. There's a metaphor in that for all of us, I think. We don't have to be the newest or the most expensive or the most obviously impressive to have value. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that have been quietly treasured, carefully tended, and allowed to shine in their own time. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a time when you chose grace over conflict or discovered your own worth in an unexpected moment, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Have you ever had an experience where staying true to yourself led to surprising recognition? Share your story below. And if you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe because I love sharing these moments of unexpected triumph and the lessons they teach us about finding strength in authenticity. The thing about being 31 and divorced is that you learn to build a life that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. My days started with coffee brewed too strong in my tiny kitchen. Sunlight streaming through windows I'd painted myself because the landlord said white was the only acceptable color. I'd ignored him and gone with soft sage green anyway. And every morning when I opened my eyes to those walls, I felt proud of that small rebellion. My house wasn't much. Just 800 square feet of 1940s craftsman charm with creaky floors, and a bathroom door that stuck, but it was entirely mine. The studio behind the house had become my sanctuary over the past 2 years. What started as a cluttered garage had transformed into something that actually looked professional, with proper lighting, a massive vintage desk I'd rescued from a school demolition, and shelves lined with design books and inspiration boards covered in fabric swatches and color combinations. I specialized in branding for small businesses, the kind of entrepreneurs who appreciated creativity over corporate polish, and my client list had grown steadily through word of mouth and genuine relationships, rather than networking events and power lunches. My sister Lisa lived 20 minutes away in a converted warehouse loft that perfectly matched her personality. All exposed brick and industrial fixtures with splashes of bold color in unexpected places. She worked as a nurse practitioner at a community health clinic, spent spending her days caring for people who couldn't afford fancy medical practices, and she had no patience for pretense or social games. When Ryan left, Lisa had been ready to key his car and leave scathing reviews on his company's website. I'd talked her out of both, but I appreciated the fierce loyalty that made her want to defend me even when I didn't need defending. My mother, Carol, lived 3 hours south in Eugene, where she taught high school English and tended a garden that produced enough vegetables to feed half the neighborhood. She'd raised Lisa and me as a single mother after our father decided family life wasn't for him when I was 8, and she'd done it with a combination of practical wisdom and gentle strength that I was still learning to emulate. When Ryan and I divorced, she drove up to Portland every weekend for 2 months, helping me paint rooms and plant flowers, and remember that I was capable of creating beauty in my own space. The marriage had ended not with dramatic fights or discovered affairs, but with the slow recognition that we wanted completely different things from life. Ryan thrived on external validation, the corner office and the networking events and the restaurants where being seen mattered more than the food. I found joy in small moments, the satisfaction of solving a design problem, or discovering a perfect vintage lamp at a flea market, or spending Sunday mornings reading in bed with coffee and classical music, playing softly from the kitchen radio. For 3 years, we'd tried to bridge that gap, each of us subtly attempting to reshape the other into someone who fit better into our vision of the future. Ryan bought me expensive clothes that hung unworn in our closet because they felt like costumes for a role I didn't want to play. I planned quiet dinner parties with good wine and interesting conversation, watching him check his phone throughout the evening and make excuses to leave early for work functions that seemed to multiply every week. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a romantic weekend in wine country. We'd driven to a beautiful resort in the Willamette Valley, and I'd been looking forward to 2 days of hiking and wine tasting and the kind of uninterrupted time together that our busy schedules rarely allowed. But Ryan spent Saturday morning on conference calls and Saturday afternoon networking with other guests by the pool, turning our getaway into another opportunity to advance his career. When I suggested we skip the resort's formal dinner to find a quiet restaurant in town, he looked at me like I'd suggested burning money. That night, lying in the resort's luxurious bed listening to Ryan scroll through emails on his phone, I realized we'd become strangers who happened to share a lease and a last name. We were both good people with good intentions, but we were incompatible in ways that couldn't be fixed with better communication or couples therapy. Some relationships end because someone does something wrong. Others end because 2 people grow in different directions despite their best efforts to stay connected. The divorce proceedings were remarkably civilized, mostly because we both knew it was the right decision and neither of us wanted to drag out the inevitable. We divided our possessions with minimal drama, sold the condo we'd bought together, and agreed to remain friendly for the sake of mutual friends and family connections. Ryan moved into a sleek downtown apartment that perfectly matched his aesthetic. All clean lines and neutral colors and furniture that looked expensive rather than comfortable. I found the little craftsman house and fell in love with its quirky charm and the way afternoon light painted patterns on the hardwood floors. For the first 6 months after the divorce, I felt like I was learning to breathe again. Simple pleasures that had been complicated during the marriage became sources of genuine joy. I could spend entire Saturdays browsing vintage shops without checking my phone to see if Ryan needed me to attend some work function. I could cook elaborate meals for one without feeling guilty about not wanting to go out to trendy restaurants where the portions were small and the conversations were loud. I could stay up until midnight working on a project that excited me without someone sighing pointedly about my irregular schedule. The loneliness came later. Not the sharp pain of missing Ryan specifically, but the gentler ache of missing companionship in general. Coming home to an empty house every evening, having no one to share small victories or daily frustrations with, eating dinner while reading a book because the silence felt too heavy without distraction. I joined a hiking group and a book club, started attending gallery openings and farmers markets, slowly building a social life that reflected my actual interests rather than obligations that came with being part of a couple. My work flourished during this period of rediscovering myself. Without the pressure to attend Ryan's networking events or maintain the image of a successful corporate wife, I could focus entirely on projects that genuinely excited me. I designed logos for a feminist bookstore, created packaging for a local honey producer, developed a complete brand identity for a nonprofit that provided art therapy for trauma survivors. Each project felt meaningful in ways that previous work hadn't, and my portfolio began reflecting the kind of creativity I'd always wanted to pursue. The studio became my refuge, a space where I could spread out project materials across every surface and leave them there for days if necessary. I'd installed a sound system that could fill the space with whatever music matched my mood, from jazz that helped me focus on detail work to folk music that inspired broader creative thinking. The walls were covered with inspiration boards that changed constantly, reflecting current projects and future dreams, and the whole space felt alive with possibility in ways my old office in the condo never had. Friends started referring other clients to me based on the quality of work I was producing, and slowly my business grew from a side hustle into something that could actually support my lifestyle. I wasn't making corporate salary money, but I didn't need corporate salary money. My expenses were lower, my stress was manageable, and every project felt like a choice rather than an obligation. For the first time in years, I woke up most mornings excited about the day ahead, rather than overwhelmed by responsibilities I'd never chosen. The house began reflecting my personality in ways the condo never had. I painted walls in colors that made me happy, hung artwork I'd collected over years of gallery visits, arranged furniture for comfort rather than style magazine aesthetics. The kitchen became my favorite room, with open shelving displaying vintage dishes I'd found at estate sales, herbs growing in mismatched pots on the windowsill, and a breakfast nook where I could sit with coffee and watch birds visit the feeder. I'd hung from the oak tree outside. My relationship with Ryan settled into something cordial but distant. We'd exchange brief texts about logistics when necessary, like when we needed to coordinate picking up mail, or when mutual friends were having events where we might both be invited. He seemed to be thriving in his new life, based on the social media posts I occasionally glimpsed, all business dinners and weekend trips and photos that looked professionally curated. I was genuinely happy for him, even if his version of success looked nothing like mine. The invitation to his wedding arrived during a particularly busy period when I was juggling 3 major projects and trying to meet overlapping deadlines. I almost didn't open it immediately, assuming it was another marketing mailer or vendor catalog, but something about the expensive paper caught my attention. Seeing Ryan's name paired with someone else's informal script felt surreal, like looking at artifacts from someone else's life. We'd been divorced for nearly 2 years, and intellectually I knew he'd moved on, but seeing it formalized in cream cardstock with gold embossing made it undeniably real. My first instinct was to decline politely and send a nice gift, avoiding the complexity of attending my ex-husband's wedding entirely. But Margaret's text explaining that Brittany had specifically requested my presence changed my perspective. If Ryan's new wife wanted me there, presumably to demonstrate her confidence and maturity, then maybe attending would provide closure for all of us. I could show that I harbored no resentment, that I was genuinely happy in my new life, and that whatever Ryan and I had shared was truly in the past. The decision to attend felt like a test of the emotional growth I'd experienced over the past 2 years. Could I celebrate someone else's happiness even when that happiness was built partially on the foundation of my own disappointment? Could I spend an evening in the same space as the woman who'd replaced me without feeling diminished or defensive? Could I represent myself with enough grace and confidence that everyone involved could move forward without awkwardness or lingering tension? Margaret's phone call came on a Thursday evening in April while I was watering the tomato seedlings I'd started on the kitchen windowsill. I'd known Ryan's mother for 7 years, and even after the divorce, she'd made it clear that she still considered me family. She sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, called occasionally to check on my work and my general well-being, and always asked after Lisa and my mother with genuine interest. Her voice on the phone carried that particular tone of someone delivering news they weren't entirely comfortable sharing. She explained that she'd been helping with wedding planning, not because Brittany needed assistance with coordination or budgeting, but because Brittany wanted to ensure every detail reflected proper social protocols. The guest list had become a particular source of discussion, with Brittany insisting on including people who would make the right impression while excluding anyone who might complicate the narrative she was crafting about Ryan's past. Margaret had been surprised when Brittany specifically asked about inviting me, expecting the opposite preference, but Brittany had been adamant that excluding the ex-wife would look petty and insecure, while including me would demonstrate her confidence and sophistication. She wanted everyone to see that she was secure enough in Ryan's affections and her own position to welcome his entire history into their celebration. Margaret relayed this explanation with the diplomatic, careful phrasing she used when discussing sensitive topics, but I could hear her skepticism about Brittany's motivations even through her polite words. The wedding was planned for the first Saturday in June at the Riverside Country Club, which I knew by reputation as the kind of establishment where Portland's old money families held their most important celebrations. The ceremony would be in Chaitya, the garden, at 4 in the afternoon, followed by cocktails on the terrace and dinner in the main ballroom. Black tie optional, which in Portland society terms meant the men would wear dark suits and the women would wear cocktail dresses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Margaret mentioned casually that Brittany's family had spared no expense, hiring the city's most sought-after wedding planner, a florist who typically worked with celebrity clients, and a photographer whose work appeared regularly in luxury lifestyle magazines. The guest list included prominent attorneys, real estate developers, city council members, and the kind of people whose names appeared in the society pages of the local newspaper. It would be the social event of the season, exactly the kind of wedding that would establish Brittany and Ryan as a power couple worth watching. I found myself genuinely curious about the woman who'd captured Ryan's attention so completely. During our marriage, he'd complained occasionally about my lack of interest in social climbing, my preference for small gatherings over large parties, my tendency to choose comfortable over fashionable when getting dressed for his work events. Brittany clearly offered everything I hadn't, and I wondered what that looked like in practice, whether their compatibility was as perfect as it appeared from the outside. Margaret shared a few details about Brittany's background, information she'd gathered through the natural gossip networks that connected Portland's established families. Brittany came from serious money, the kind that had been accumulating for generations rather than recently earned. Her father owned commercial properties throughout the Pearl District and had political connections that opened doors other people couldn't access. Her mother served on nonprofit boards and organized charity galas, the kind of woman who appeared in local magazines wearing designer gowns and discussing her philanthropic passions. Brittany herself had graduated from Lewis and Clark with a degree she'd never used professionally, instead focusing on the full-time job of maintaining her social position and eventually finding a husband who could match her family's expectations. She volunteered with appropriate organizations, attended all the right events, and cultivated relationships that would benefit her future husband's career advancement. In many ways, she was exactly what Ryan had always wanted in a partner, someone who understood that success required strategic social positioning as much as professional competence. The more Margaret talked, the more I understood why Ryan had been attracted to Brittany and why their relationship had developed so quickly. She offered not just companionship, but access to a social network that could accelerate his career in ways I never could have provided. She knew which events to attend and which to avoid, which people to cultivate, and which to politely distance herself from, which charities to support, and which restaurants to frequent. She could be the kind of corporate wife I'd never wanted to become, comfortable with schmoozing and small talk and the subtle negotiations that happened at cocktail parties. Margaret's tone suggested she had mixed feelings about her son's choice, appreciating Brittany's obvious devotion to Ryan while perhaps missing the easier warmth I'd brought to family gatherings. She mentioned that Brittany was unfailingly polite, and appropriately attentive, but that conversations with her felt somewhat scripted, as if she'd been trained to say the right things rather than speaking from genuine emotion. It was the kind of observation Margaret would never state directly, but her careful word choices conveyed her meaning clearly enough. The wedding planning process had apparently been intensive, with Brittany treating every decision as an opportunity to showcase her taste and family's resources. She'd insisted on roses flown in from Ecuador, linens imported from Italy, and a menu designed by a chef who normally only worked at the city's most exclusive restaurants. The invitation design alone had required 3 rounds of revision and approval from a stationer who typically worked with museum galas and political fundraisers. Margaret mentioned that she'd suggested including me on the guest list during one of their planning sessions, thinking it would demonstrate healthy family dynamics and mature handling of past relationships. To her surprise, Brittany had immediately agreed, even seemed pleased by the suggestion. She'd explained that including me would show everyone that she was confident enough in her relationship with Ryan not to feel threatened by his past, and that their love was strong enough to embrace his entire history without reservation. But something in the way Margaret described this conversation made me suspect there were layers to Brittany's motivation that weren't immediately obvious. Including the ex-wife at a wedding could be a gesture of mature confidence, but it could also be an opportunity to publicly demonstrate superiority, to show the community exactly what the groom had traded up to and make sure everyone understood the improvement he'd made. The invitation itself might be less about graciousness and more about creating a stage for comparison. I asked Margaret directly whether she thought I should attend, curious about her honest opinion rather than her diplomatic assessment. She was quiet for a long moment before admitting that she wasn't entirely sure what Brittany hoped to accomplish by having me there, but that she'd love to see me regardless of the underlying motivations. She missed our conversations and wanted to introduce me to other family members who hadn't seen me since the divorce, people who'd always been kind and continued to ask about my well-being. The conversation left me with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer sense of what attending might involve. This wouldn't be a casual celebration where I could blend into the background and slip away early. It would be a formal social event where every interaction would be observed and analyzed, where my presence would inevitably become part of the story people told about Ryan's transition from his first marriage to his second. I would be representing not just myself, but the chapter of Ryan's life that was officially ending with this ceremony. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking about the invitation at unexpected moments, weighing the potential benefits against the obvious risks. Attending could provide genuine closure, a chance to demonstrate that I'd moved forward successfully and harbored no resentment about the marriage's end. It could show mutual friends and family that everyone involved was mature enough to handle complex social situations with grace. It could even be interesting, an opportunity to observe the kind of life Ryan had chosen and understand better why our marriage had needed to end. But attending could also be emotionally complicated in ways I couldn't anticipate. Seeing Ryan pledge his future to someone else might hurt more than I expected, even though I'd intellectually processed the end of our marriage years ago. Being in the same space as Brittany for an entire evening might reveal dynamics I wasn't prepared to handle. The event could become a subtle competition I didn't want to participate in, with undercurrents of comparison and judgment that would leave everyone feeling uncomfortable. The decision ultimately came down to a question of personal integrity versus social comfort. I could stay home and avoid any potential awkwardness, maintaining the peaceful distance I'd established from Ryan's new life. Or I could attend and demonstrate the kind of mature confidence I hoped I'd developed over the past 2 years, showing that I was secure enough in my own choices not to feel threatened by his. The choice would say something about who I'd become during the divorce recovery process and what kind of person I wanted to be going forward. The marriage had been dying for months before either of us was brave enough to acknowledge it. Looking back, I can see the signs that seemed normal at the time but were actually symptoms of fundamental incompatibility. Ryan would come home from work, energized by the networking and deal-making and office politics that fueled his days, ready to dissect every conversation and strategize about upcoming opportunities. I would emerge from my studio drained by creative work and grateful for quiet evenings with simple dinners and gentle conversation, needing to recharge rather than continue processing the day's experiences. Our social lives became a source of constant negotiation. Ryan thrived at large gatherings where he could work the room, collecting business cards and making connections that might benefit his career advancement. I preferred smaller groups where genuine conversation was possible, where people shared ideas and stories rather than elevator pitches and professional accomplishments. We'd attend events together and spend the entire drive home debriefing completely different experiences of the same evening, neither of us understanding how the other had interpreted what happened. The pressure to be the right kind of corporate wife intensified as Ryan's career progressed. Suddenly, every invitation came with unspoken expectations about how I should dress, what I should say, which people I should make effort to remember and cultivate. I found myself spending money on clothes I didn't like for events I didn't enjoy, smiling through conversations about topics that bored me, pretending enthusiasm for lifestyle choices that felt completely foreign to my actual interests and values. Ryan never explicitly demanded that I change, but his disappointment was obvious when I failed to meet expectations I hadn't known existed. If I wore something comfortable rather than impressive to a work function, he'd mention later how polished other wives had looked. If I declined invitations to events that conflicted with my work deadlines or simply didn't interest me, he'd point out missed opportunities for important connections. If I suggested we spend weekends on activities I enjoyed rather than social obligations he prioritized, he'd explain why those obligations were necessary for his professional advancement. The disconnect affected our physical intimacy as well. Ryan wanted a partner who could match his energy and ambition, someone who got excited about the same goals and challenges that motivated him. But I needed someone who could appreciate quiet moments and simple pleasures, who understood that success could be measured in creative satisfaction rather than salary increases and social status. We were both good people trying to love each other well, but we were fundamentally seeking different things from life and partnership. The financial discussions revealed another layer of incompatibility. Ryan wanted to live at the edge of our means, investing in the kind of lifestyle that would support his career advancement, even if it meant carrying debt and feeling constant pressure to earn more. I preferred security and simplicity, wanting to save money for unexpected expenses and creative projects rather than spending everything on maintaining appearances. We'd argue about restaurant choices and vacation destinations and home furnishings, each of us unable to understand why the other's priorities seemed so foreign. My work became a particular source of tension as it grew more successful and demanded more of my time and creative energy. Ryan initially supported my freelance graphic design business, appreciating the additional income and the flexibility it provided. But as my client list expanded and my projects became more complex, he grew frustrated with my irregular schedule and the way creative work sometimes consumed my attention completely. He wanted a partner who could prioritize his needs and career above her own professional interests, while I needed someone who understood that my work was as important to me as his was to him. The social expectations became increasingly exhausting. I'd attend corporate parties and charity fundraisers, making conversation with people whose values seemed entirely focused on acquisition and advancement. They talked about vacation destinations I couldn't afford, restaurants that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and social events that felt like elaborate performances rather than genuine celebrations. I'd smile and nod and ask appropriate questions, but internally, I felt like an actress playing a role that didn't fit my actual personality. Ryan's colleagues' wives seemed to navigate these social situations effortlessly, discussing private schools and luxury renovations and charitable board positions with the kind of casual expertise that indicated genuine familiarity with that lifestyle. They knew which nonprofits were considered most prestigious to support, which neighborhoods were rising in desirability, which designers were currently fashionable for home decorating. I felt like I was constantly trying to decode a language I'd never learned, struggling to participate in conversations about experiences I'd never had. The breaking point came during a weekend retreat Ryan's company organized for senior employees and their spouses. We'd driven to a resort on the Oregon coast, and I'd been looking forward to walks on the beach and quiet time together away from work pressures. But the weekend was structured around team-building activities and networking opportunities, with scheduled meals and presentations that felt like extensions of office meetings rather than vacation relaxation. During one particularly awkward dinner, I found myself seated between two corporate wives who spent the entire meal discussing their children's private school applications and their family's vacation home purchases. They were perfectly pleasant women, but their concerns felt so far removed from my daily reality that I struggled to contribute meaningful responses to their conversations. When they asked about my work, I tried to explain graphic design in terms that might interest them, but their polite smiles and quick topic changes made it clear that creative services weren't considered serious career choices in their social circle. That night, lying in the resort's king-sized bed while Ryan reviewed presentation materials for the next day's meetings, I realized I felt more lonely in his presence than I did when I was actually alone. We were sharing physical space without any genuine emotional connection, going through motions of partnership without the underlying compatibility that makes marriage sustainable. I'd been trying so hard to become the kind of person he needed that I'd lost touch with who I actually was, and the effort was exhausting me in ways that couldn't be fixed with better communication or renewed commitment. The conversation about ending our marriage happened gradually over several weeks, both of us finally acknowledging what we'd been avoiding for months. Ryan admitted that he'd hoped I would grow to enjoy the social aspects of his career advancement, that my creative talents might translate into enthusiasm for event planning and relationship building. I confessed that I'd tried to develop interest in his professional world, but felt increasingly disconnected from activities that seemed performative, rather than meaningful. We were both relieved to stop pretending compatibility that didn't exist. The divorce process revealed how different our values had become. Ryan wanted to maintain the downtown condo and the lifestyle that went with it, even if it meant taking on additional debt. I wanted to downsize and simplify, creating space for creative work and personal relationships rather than career advancement and social positioning. We divided our possessions based on these different priorities, Ryan keeping furniture and artwork that looked impressive, while I chose items with sentimental value or practical utility. Moving into the craftsman house felt like stepping back into my authentic self after years of trying to fit into someone else's vision of success. I could decorate with vintage pieces that reflected my actual taste rather than current fashion trends. I could cook simple meals with ingredients from farmers markets rather than impressive dinners designed to photograph well. I could work on projects that excited me rather than accepting clients based primarily on their ability to advance my social status. The loneliness that followed was different from the isolation I'd felt during the marriage's final months. Instead of feeling disconnected while surrounded by people and activities, I felt genuinely alone, but also genuinely myself. I missed having someone to share daily experiences with, but I didn't miss the constant pressure to be someone I wasn't. The quiet evenings at home felt peaceful rather than empty, and my work flourished without the underlying tension of trying to balance my creative needs with someone else's social expectations. Recovery involved rediscovering interests and friendships I'd neglected during the marriage. I started hiking regularly with a group that met every Saturday morning, spending hours in forests and along rivers with people who valued natural beauty over networking opportunities. I joined a book club that met monthly in members' homes, discussing literature and current events with women whose perspectives challenged and inspired me. I began attending gallery openings and craft fairs, slowly building connections with other artists and creative professionals. The creative work that emerged during this period was more authentic and compelling than anything I'd produced while married. Without the pressure to maintain a certain lifestyle or social position, I could choose projects based on their artistic merit and personal meaning rather than their financial potential or social prestige. I designed materials for environmental, nonprofits, small businesses owned by women and minorities, and cultural organizations that reflected my actual values rather than the values I'd been trying to adopt. The decision to attend Ryan's wedding required months of emotional and practical preparation. Once I'd committed to going, every choice became an opportunity to demonstrate the person I'd become rather than defend the person I used to be. The process started with finding something appropriate to wear, which proved more complicated than I'd anticipated. The invitation specified black tie optional, which in Portland's social circles typically meant cocktail attire that struck the right balance between elegant and understated, expensive-looking, but not ostentatious. My budget for wedding guest. Attire was limited, both by practical financial constraints and by philosophical reluctance to spend large amounts on clothes I'd wear once. But I also understood that my appearance at this particular event would inevitably be scrutinized and discussed, not out of malice, but simply because the ex-wife's presence at a wedding always generates curiosity about how everyone is handling the social dynamics. I needed to look polished and confident without appearing to compete with the bride or seem inappropriately festive about my ex-husband's remarriage. The search for the perfect dress led me through department stores and boutiques I rarely visited, trying on options that felt either too formal for my personality or too casual for the venue. Everything that fit my budget looked obviously inexpensive, while everything that looked appropriate for the setting exceeded what I was comfortable spending. I was beginning to consider renting something when Lisa suggested we explore some of the vintage shops and estate sales that had become my favorite weekend activities for furniture and home decor. The estate sale in the Hawthorne district was being held in a 1920s bungalow that immediately caught my attention with its original hardwood floors and built-in bookcases filled with decades of accumulated treasures. The woman running the sale explained that she was settling her aunt's estate, and that her aunt had been a woman of sophisticated taste who'd never married or had children, but had lived a rich life filled with travel and cultural experiences. The house reflected those experiences, with furniture and artwork and clothing that told stories of someone who'd valued beauty and craftsmanship over trends and status symbols. I was browsing through books and small decorative objects when I noticed the dress hanging in the back bedroom, almost hidden behind more contemporary pieces that clearly didn't belong to the original owner. The cream silk caught afternoon light, streaming through lace curtains, and even from across the room I could see the intricate beadwork that decorated the bodice and sleeves. When I lifted it from the rack to examine it more closely, I realized I was holding something extraordinary, a piece that had been created with the kind of attention to detail that modern manufacturing rarely achieves. The beadwork was entirely hand-sewn, tiny pearls and crystals arranged in patterns that suggested Art Deco influences while maintaining a timeless elegance that transcended specific fashion eras. The silk was high quality, probably originally quite expensive, and had been carefully stored to prevent damage from light or moisture. The construction details revealed that this had been either a custom piece or produced by a couture house that no longer existed, with hand-finished seams and interfacing that had maintained its shape despite decades of storage. The woman managing the sale told me the dress had belonged to her Aunt Margaret, not Ryan's mother, but a different Margaret who'd been a socialite in San Francisco during the 1960s. She'd worn it to gallery openings and theater premieres, charity galas, and intimate dinner parties, but had never found another occasion special enough to justify bringing it out of storage after her social life quieted in the 1970s. It had been carefully preserved in tissue paper and cedar blocks, waiting for someone who would appreciate its craftsmanship and give it new life. $25 seemed almost insultingly low for something of such obvious quality, but the woman explained that she lived across the country and couldn't take large items with her, and that she'd rather see beautiful things go to people who would treasure them than hold out for prices that reflected their actual value. She could tell I understood what I was looking at, she said, and that was worth more to her than maximizing profit from her aunt's possessions. At home, I hung the dress carefully and spent time simply looking at it, trying to understand its construction and imagine the women who'd worn it to important events decades before I was born. The color was perfect for a wedding, elegant without being bridal, sophisticated without being somber. The length hit just below the knee, appropriate for daytime or evening events, and the neckline was graceful without being revealing. It was exactly what I'd been searching for, except that it was obviously too large for my frame. The alteration process became a meditation on craftsmanship and patience. I carefully removed the dress's seams, studying how each piece had been cut and joined, noting the way the beadwork aligned perfectly with structural elements and the subtle techniques that had been used to create the garment's elegant drape. The silk was delicate but strong, and I worked slowly to avoid damaging either the fabric or the intricate bead patterns that would be impossible to replicate if disturbed. Reshaping the dress to fit my body required understanding not just my measurements, but also the garment's original design intentions. The beadwork couldn't be moved without destroying the patterns, so I had to plan my alterations around maintaining those decorative elements while creating a silhouette that flattered my proportions. I shortened the hem gradually, checking the balance after each adjustment, and carefully took in the sides to follow my natural waistline without disrupting the way the silk moved when I walked. The process took 3 weeks of evening work, spreading fabric and thread and tiny scissors across my kitchen table after finishing client projects each day. I found the detailed handwork relaxing after hours of computer-based design work, and there was something deeply satisfying about giving new life to something that had been created with such obvious care and skill. Each evening's progress brought the dress closer to fitting perfectly, and I began to feel genuinely excited about wearing something so beautiful to an event that had previously filled me with anxiety. Lisa came over the evening I completed the final adjustments, bringing wine and Chinese takeout to celebrate my accomplishment. When I emerged from the bedroom wearing the finished dress, her expression told me immediately that the project had been successful. The dress fit as if it had been made specifically for me, the beadwork catching light from the overhead fixture and creating subtle sparkles that moved with my movements. The color complemented my skin tone perfectly, and the classic silhouette was flattering without being attention-seeking. We spent an hour discussing accessories and shoes, settling on my grandmother's pearl earrings and a simple pair of nude heels that would be comfortable for several hours of standing and walking. Lisa helped me practice walking in the dress, making sure the altered hem hit at exactly the right length and that I felt confident moving naturally rather than carefully. By the time she left that evening, I felt genuinely prepared for the wedding in ways that had nothing to do with social strategy or emotional armor. The final weeks before the wedding were filled with other forms of preparation as well. I scheduled a hair appointment for the morning of the event, planning a simple updo that would complement the dress's vintage aesthetic without competing with its elaborate beadwork. I researched the venue's layout and parking situation, wanting to minimize logistical stress on a day that would already be emotionally complex. I even practiced small talk and responses to questions I might be asked, not because I intended to be dishonest, but because I wanted to represent myself clearly and kindly. Most importantly, I spent time considering my intentions for attending and the attitude I wanted to bring to the celebration. I genuinely wanted Ryan to be happy, and if Brittany made him happy, then I wanted to support that relationship even if I didn't understand their compatibility. I hoped to demonstrate that divorce didn't have to create permanent animosity, that two people could end their marriage with mutual respect and genuine wishes for each other's future well-being. I wanted to show family and friends that I'd moved forward successfully, not by diminishing my past with Ryan, but by building a life that suited me better. The dress became a symbol of that intention, representing my ability to create something beautiful from unexpected materials, to recognize value that others might overlook, and to invest time and care in projects that mattered to me regardless of their obvious utility. Wearing it to Ryan's wedding felt like wearing a statement about who I'd become and what I'd learned about myself during the years since our marriage ended. It was armor made of silk and starlight, protection that came from confidence rather than defensiveness. The morning of the wedding dawned with the kind of perfect June weather that Portland saves for its most important occasions. Clear skies stretched endlessly above the city, and the temperature promised to be warm without being uncomfortably hot. I'd slept better than expected, waking naturally at 7 with sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows and birds singing enthusiastically in the oak tree outside. The cream silk dress hung on the closet door where I'd placed it the night before, looking even more beautiful in morning light than it had under artificial illumination. My appointment at the salon was scheduled for 10, giving me time for coffee and a light breakfast before beginning the day's preparations. I'd chosen a salon in the Pearl District, not far from the country club, reasoning that the stylists there would understand the aesthetic I was hoping to achieve and have experience with formal events. The hairdresser, a woman named Sophia with an impressive portfolio of wedding and special occasion work, had been enthusiastic when I described the vintage dress and my vision for complementing its 1960s elegance with a classic updo. The process of getting ready felt like a ritual of transformation, each step bringing me closer to the version of myself I wanted to present at the wedding. Sophia created an elegant chignon that showcased my grandmother's pearl earrings while leaving a few soft tendrils to frame my face. The style was sophisticated without being severe, polished without looking overly formal for a daytime ceremony. She applied makeup that enhanced my natural features while maintaining the understated elegance that matched the dress, using techniques that would photograph well in natural light. Lisa arrived at my house at noon to help with final preparations and provide moral support during the drive to the venue. She'd insisted on accompanying me, partly because she knew the emotional complexity of the day, and partly because she was genuinely curious about the kind of wedding Brittany would orchestrate. Lisa had never met Ryan's new wife, but she'd formed strong opinions based on my descriptions and the social media posts she'd investigated with the thoroughness of a private detective. When I emerged from the bedroom wearing the completed ensemble, Lisa's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. The dress fit perfectly, the alterations having created a silhouette that was both flattering and appropriate for the occasion. The cream silk moved beautifully when I walked, and the beadwork caught light in ways that created subtle sparkle without being ostentatious. My grandmother's pearls provided the perfect accent, adding warmth and family history to an outfit that felt both vintage and contemporary. We drove toward the Riverside Country Club with the windows slightly down, allowing the warm afternoon air to circulate without disturbing my carefully styled hair. Lisa provided a steady stream of encouraging commentary, reminding me of my strengths and accomplishments, reinforcing the confidence I'd been building throughout the preparation process. She'd brought emergency supplies in her purse, everything from safety pins to breath mints to tissues, prepared for any contingency that might arise during the event. The country club's entrance was marked by stone pillars and perfectly manicured landscaping that spoke of generations of careful maintenance and substantial financial investment. The circular drive curved past fountains and flower beds that looked like they'd been designed by landscape architects and maintained by teams of professional gardeners. Luxury vehicles lined the drive, valets in crisp white jackets directing traffic with the efficiency of people accustomed to managing high-end events. As we approached the valet stand, I caught glimpses of other wedding guests making their way toward the ceremony site. The women wore dresses that clearly represented significant financial investments, their accessories and shoes chosen to complement carefully coordinated ensembles. The men looked comfortable in their formal attire, wearing suits and ties with the ease of people who attended such events regularly. Everyone moved with the confident stride of individuals who belonged in these surroundings without question. Lisa squeezed my hand as the valet opened our car door. "You look absolutely stunning," she whispered. "Remember that you belong here just as much as anyone else. You were part of Ryan's life for 7 years, and you have every right to celebrate this transition with grace and dignity." Her words provided the final boost of confidence I needed to step out of the car and begin navigating the social complexities that lay ahead. The ceremony site was located in the club's formal garden, where white chairs arranged in perfect rows faced an arch covered with white roses and trailing greenery. The setting was undeniably beautiful, with mature trees providing natural shade and the distant view of the Willamette River creating a picturesque backdrop. Professional photographers moved discreetly around the perimeter, capturing pre-ceremony moments with the kind of expensive equipment that suggested this wedding would be thoroughly documented. I selected a seat toward the middle of the assembled guests, close enough to demonstrate appropriate interest in the ceremony, but far enough back to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. The other attendees represented exactly the demographic I'd expected: Portland's professional and social elite dressed in their finest attire and speaking in the kind of cultured tones that suggested expensive educations and comfortable financial circumstances. Conversations revolved around mutual acquaintances, recent travel experiences, and business developments that would be of interest to people in similar social circles. The arrival of the wedding party created a palpable shift in the garden's atmosphere. Groomsmen in perfectly tailored black suits took their positions near the rose arch, followed by bridesmaids wearing dusty blue dresses that had clearly been chosen to complement Brittany's aesthetic vision. Each element of the ceremony reflected careful planning and substantial financial investment, from the string quartet's professional quality performance to the floral arrangements that looked like they'd been transported directly from a luxury hotel lobby. When the bridal processional music began, every head turned toward the garden's entrance. Brittany appeared at the far end of the petal-strewn aisle, wearing a dress that was undoubtedly couture, probably custom-designed specifically for her body and the occasion. The gown featured layers of ivory silk and intricate beadwork that must have required hundreds of hours of hand-sewing, with a cathedral-length veil that flowed behind her like liquid moonlight. Her bouquet was an architectural masterpiece of white orchids and trailing ribbons, held at exactly the right angle to showcase both the flowers and her professionally manicured hands. She moved down the aisle with the confident grace of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life, her smile radiant as she accepted the admiring gazes of 200 guests. Her father, distinguished in his formal morning coat, walked beside her with obvious pride. Everything about the processional was choreographed to perfection, from the timing of the music to the pace of their steps, to the way her veil cascaded around her feet without creating any risk of tripping. Ryan waited at the altar wearing a black tuxedo that fit him perfectly, his hair styled with the kind of precision that suggested a professional barber's attention. His expression as he watched Brittany approach was one of genuine happiness and anticipation. The look of a man who felt fortunate to be marrying someone so obviously desirable. Whatever complications had existed in our marriage, whatever incompatibilities had made our relationship unsustainable, were clearly not issues in his partnership with Brittany. The ceremony itself was traditional and elegant, filled with classical music and formal vows that spoke of commitment and partnership, in language that felt both timeless and appropriate for the setting. The officiant, a distinguished older man who was probably a family friend or longtime minister, delivered remarks about marriage as a union of not just two individuals but two families and social networks. Everything proceeded smoothly, with the kind of flawless execution that suggested extensive rehearsal and professional coordination. When Ryan and Brittany exchanged rings, the diamonds caught sunlight and threw tiny rainbows across the garden. When they kissed to seal their union, the assembled guests erupted in enthusiastic applause. Professional photographers captured every moment from multiple angles, ensuring that this wedding would be documented with the thoroughness appropriate to such a significant social event. The couple's happiness was obvious and infectious, and I found myself genuinely moved by their joy, despite the complexity of my own feelings about being present. As guests began moving from the ceremony site toward the cocktail reception, I allowed myself to be swept along with the crowd, rather than lingering or trying to avoid the inevitable social interactions. The cocktail hour was set up on the club's main terrace, overlooking manicured grounds that rolled down toward the river. Servers in black uniforms circulated with champagne and elegant hors d'oeuvres that had clearly been prepared by a catering team accustomed to high-end events. The terrace buzzed with conversation as guests congratulated the couple and began the process of socializing that would continue throughout the evening. I accepted a glass of champagne and found a position near the stone railing where I could observe the gathering without being drawn into conversations I wasn't prepared to navigate. The view of the river was genuinely lovely, with boats moving slowly along the water and the late afternoon sun creating golden reflections on the surface. Several people approached me during the first few minutes of the cocktail hour, some recognizing me from my marriage to Ryan and others simply being friendly to someone who appeared to be attending alone. The conversations were pleasant and superficial, focused on the beauty of the ceremony and the elegance of the venue rather than personal details or potentially uncomfortable topics. I found myself relaxing slightly, beginning to think that the evening might proceed without the drama I'd been unconsciously anticipating. That sense of relief lasted exactly 15 minutes, until I noticed a small commotion near the terrace entrance. Brittany had changed from her ceremony gown into a shorter reception dress, still clearly designer, but more suitable for dancing and mingling. The new dress was ivory silk with subtle beading, cut to showcase her figure while maintaining the sophisticated elegance that had characterized every aspect of the wedding planning. She moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and posing for photographs, every inch the radiant bride enjoying her moment of triumph. But something in her demeanor shifted when she spotted me across the terrace. Her smile remained perfectly in place, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she assessed my appearance with the kind of thorough evaluation that suggested she was cataloging every detail of my outfit for later analysis. She said something to the bridesmaids who flanked her, and I watched them turn to look in my direction with expressions of curiosity mixed with something that might have been calculation. The three women began moving through the crowd toward my position by the railing, stopping occasionally to accept congratulations or pose for photos, but clearly maintaining their trajectory. I remained where I was, sipping champagne and maintaining the calm composure I'd been practicing for months. Whatever Brittany had planned for this encounter, I was determined to handle it with the grace and dignity that would reflect well on everyone involved. As they approached, I could see that Brittany's bridesmaids were exactly the type of women I'd expected her to choose. Both appeared to be in their late 20s, dressed in expensive cocktail attire that complemented without competing with the bride's ensemble. Their makeup was professionally applied, their jewelry was understated but clearly costly, and they moved with the confident ease of people accustomed to being noticed and admired at social gatherings. When Brittany finally reached my position, by the railing, her smile was brilliant and slightly predatory. "Emma," she said warmly, her voice carrying clearly enough that nearby conversations paused as people turned to observe this potentially interesting interaction. "I'm so glad you could make it. You look lovely." Her eyes traveled over my vintage dress with obvious assessment, taking in every detail from the hand-sewn beadwork to the careful alterations that had made it fit perfectly. I returned her smile with genuine warmth, determined to begin this interaction on a positive note, regardless of whatever underlying tensions might exist. "Thank you so much for including me, Brittany. The ceremony was absolutely beautiful and you look radiant. Ryan is a lucky man." The compliment was sincere, and I hoped it would set a tone of mutual respect for whatever conversation was about to unfold. But Brittany's response suggested she had different intentions for our exchange. "What a unique dress," she continued, her voice honeyed with the kind of false sweetness that often precedes less charitable observations. "It's so interesting how you can find these vintage pieces. Where did you discover this particular gem?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something in her tone suggested she was setting up for a less flattering follow-up comment. The shift in Brittany's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. like watching clouds gather before a storm that might or might not actually break. Her smile remained perfectly positioned, but her eyes had taken on the sharp focus of someone preparing to make a point at someone else's expense. The two bridesmaids flanking her seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, their own expressions becoming more alert and slightly predatory as they waited to see what their friend had planned. Other guests were beginning to notice our little gathering, drawn by the particular kind of tension that develops when social dynamics become interesting. Conversations around us slowed as people positioned themselves to observe without appearing to eavesdrop, the way experienced partygoers do when they sense that drama might be about to unfold. I could feel the weight of their attention while maintaining my focus on Brittany's carefully constructed expression of friendly interest. My response about finding the dress at an estate sale had clearly provided exactly the opening Brittany had been hoping for. Her eyebrows rose in an expression of delighted surprise that felt entirely performed. "An estate sale," she repeated, her voice carrying just enough projection to ensure that nearby guests could hear every word. "How resourceful of you. I just love people who can work with what they have available." The backhanded compliment hung in the air between us, its meaning clear to anyone who understood the subtle language of social warfare. She was establishing that my dress, regardless of how it looked, was fundamentally different from the kind of attire that belonged at events like this. It was secondhand, budget-conscious, the choice of someone who couldn't afford to shop in the same stores where she and her friends acquired their wardrobes. One of the bridesmaids, a blonde woman whose jewelry probably cost more than my monthly rent, leaned forward with an expression of exaggerated interest. "That's so smart," she said with the kind of enthusiasm that felt distinctly mocking. "I always admire people who can make thrift store finds look so polished. It must take a lot of creativity to put together outfits when you're working with such limited options." The comment was designed to sting, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks despite my best efforts to remain composed. But something about the obviousness of their strategy helped me maintain perspective. These women were working together to make me feel small and out of place, using tactics that revealed more about their own insecurities than about any actual problems with my appearance or behavior. I took a slow sip of champagne before responding, using the pause to center myself and choose my words carefully. "I've always enjoyed the hunt for unique pieces," I said calmly. "There's something satisfying about discovering beautiful things that other people might overlook." The response was truthful without being defensive, acknowledging their premise while refusing to accept their implied judgment. Brittany's smile sharpened, and I could see that my measured response hadn't provided the reaction she'd been hoping for. She'd wanted me to become flustered or defensive, to justify my choices in ways that would make me appear apologetic about my circumstances. Instead, I'd presented my vintage shopping as a positive choice rather than a financial necessity, which didn't fit the narrative she was attempting to construct. The second bridesmaid, a brunette with perfectly straightened hair and diamond earrings that caught the afternoon light, decided to escalate the subtle attack. "It's wonderful that you're so environmentally conscious," she said with mock solemnity. "Reusing clothes is such an important way to reduce waste. I keep meaning to donate some of my older pieces to charity, but I never seem to find the time to clean out my closets." The implication was clear and cutting. While they purchased new designer pieces regularly enough that closet space was a concern, I was shopping in the same charitable donation centers where they disposed of their cast-offs. It was a particularly elegant insult, framed as environmental consciousness, while actually highlighting economic disparity and suggesting that I was essentially wearing their discarded clothing. A small crowd had definitely gathered around us. Now, drawn by the increasingly obvious tension and the spectacle of the bride publicly engaging with her husband's ex-wife. I could see Lisa moving through the crowd toward our position, her expression concerned as she recognized that this conversation had moved beyond polite social interaction into something more deliberately hostile. But something remarkable happened as I stood there absorbing their increasingly pointed comments. Instead of feeling diminished or embarrassed, I found myself feeling genuinely sorry for women who clearly felt so threatened by my presence that they needed to work together to try to humiliate me at what should have been one of the happiest days of Brittany's life. Their behavior revealed an insecurity so profound that they couldn't simply enjoy their obvious advantages without trying to make someone else feel inferior. The vintage dress I was wearing had cost $25 plus several evenings of careful alteration work, but it was constructed better than anything these women were likely to find in contemporary stores. The beadwork was entirely hand-sewn, the silk was genuine rather than synthetic, and the design had been created during an era when clothing was expected to last for decades rather than seasons. I was wearing a piece of fashion history, lovingly, preserved and thoughtfully restored, created by craftspeople whose skills had largely disappeared from modern manufacturing. More importantly, I was wearing something that reflected my actual values and interests, rather than my ability to spend money on status symbols. The dress represented creativity, sustainability, appreciation for craftsmanship, and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful through skill and patience. It told a story about who I was and what I cared about, while their designer ensembles primarily communicated their family's financial resources and their willingness to spend large amounts on temporary fashion trends. Brittany seemed to sense that her strategy wasn't achieving the desired effect, so she decided to abandon subtlety in favor of a more direct approach. "You know, Emma," she said with a laugh that sounded crystalline and sharp, "I really admire your confidence. It must be nice not to worry about keeping up with current fashion trends. Some of us feel so much pressure to always look perfectly put together, but you've found a way to just embrace your own unique style." The insult was wrapped in language that could be interpreted as complimentary, but its meaning was unmistakable. She was suggesting that I'd given up on trying to look fashionable or current, that I'd settled for unique because I couldn't achieve stylish. She was positioning herself as someone who faced the burden of high expectations while implying that I'd been relieved of such pressures because no one expected me to meet them. The gathering crowd was now large enough that our conversation had become a public spectacle, exactly what Brittany had apparently intended from the beginning. She was using her wedding reception as a stage to demonstrate her superiority over Ryan's previous wife, ensuring that everyone present would witness her ability to graciously include me while simultaneously making it clear that I represented his past rather than his future. I looked around at the faces surrounding us, seeing expressions that ranged from uncomfortable embarrassment to fascinated anticipation. These were Ryan's colleagues and friends, Brittany's family and social connections, people who would remember this moment and discuss it later when analyzing the wedding's most interesting developments. Whatever happened next would become part of the story they told about this event, and Brittany was clearly hoping that story would position her as confidently magnanimous while making me appear diminished and out of place. Lisa had finally reached the edge of our circle, her expression tight with barely controlled anger as she assessed the situation. I caught her eye and gave the slightest shake of my head, hoping she would understand that I needed to handle this myself rather than having someone rescue me. This moment was about more than just defending myself against petty insults. It was about demonstrating the kind of person I'd become and the values I'd chosen to embrace. The realization that came to me in that moment was liberating and powerful. I didn't need to defend my choices or justify my circumstances to women who were so insecure that they felt threatened by someone they perceived as having less than they did. I didn't need to prove my worth to people who measured value primarily through price tags and brand names. I didn't need to engage in a competition that I had no interest in winning because the prize held no appeal for me. Instead of responding to Brittany's latest veiled insult, I simply smiled with genuine warmth and said, "Thank you for the lovely compliment. I hope you and Ryan have a wonderful evening celebrating. This is such a beautiful venue, and everything has been planned so thoughtfully." Then I turned slightly toward the river view, effectively ending my participation in the conversation without appearing rude or defensive. The response clearly wasn't what Brittany had expected. She'd been building toward what was probably intended to to be a more devastating final comment, something that would leave me visibly upset or scrambling to defend myself. Instead, I'd graciously accepted her backhanded compliments at face value and redirected attention to appropriate wedding topics, making it difficult for her to continue the attack without appearing obviously mean-spirited. But Brittany wasn't finished with her performance. After a moment of apparent confusion about how to proceed, she decided to abandon any pretense of subtlety. "Well," she said with a laugh that sounded forced, "I suppose when you're on a tight budget, you have to get creative with your wardrobe choices. It's actually quite inspiring how you've managed to put together something so presentable from secondhand sources." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Several guests looked away, clearly embarrassed by Brittany's obvious attempt to humiliate someone at her own wedding reception. Others stared with the fascination people have for social disasters, waiting to see how the situation would resolve itself. Lisa looked like she was preparing to intervene forcefully if I didn't respond appropriately to what was clearly a deliberate public insult. The moment stretched between us like a taut wire, vibrating with tension that had finally moved beyond the realm of subtle social maneuvering into something much more direct and potentially damaging. Brittany's last comment had crossed the line from veiled insults into obvious cruelty, and the gathered crowd recognized the shift immediately. The conversations around us had ceased entirely, replaced by the kind of charged silence that develops when people witness behavior that violates social norms so clearly that everyone present feels uncomfortable. Brittany herself seemed to realize that she'd pushed too far, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her aggression. Perhaps she felt that having committed to this course of action, she needed to see it through to some kind of conclusion that would definitively establish her superiority. Perhaps she was driven by nervousness about being the center of attention at her own wedding, and was channeling that energy into an attack on someone she perceived as a threat to her narrative of triumph. Whatever her motivation, she wasn't finished. After looking around at the circle of guests who were now openly staring at our exchange, she turned back to me with a smile that no longer contained even the pretense of warmth. "I just think it's so important to be realistic about our circumstances," she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the terrace. "Some people can afford to shop at the finest boutiques for events like this, and others have to make do with whatever they can find at garage sales and thrift stores." The cruelty of the comment was breathtaking, not just because of its obvious intent to humiliate me, but because of its timing and setting. This was her wedding day, supposedly the happiest day of her life, and she was using it as an opportunity to publicly shame someone who had done nothing more threatening than attend an event she'd been specifically invited to. The behavior revealed something deeply troubling about her character and her priorities. I could feel the weight of everyone's attention focused on me, waiting to see how I would respond to such a blatant attack. Some faces in the crowd showed sympathy, others displayed the kind of uncomfortable fascination that people have for public confrontations. Lisa looked like she was about to push through the circle and give Brittany a piece of her mind. Consequences. Be damned. Even the servers had slowed their circulation to observe the drama unfolding near the terrace railing. But in that moment of intense pressure and public scrutiny, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling hurt or angry or defensive, I felt a profound sense of clarity about the situation and my role in it. I could see Brittany clearly for who she was, someone so insecure about her own worth that she needed to diminish others, to feel valuable, someone who had been given every advantage in life, but still felt threatened by a woman whose only crime was having once been married to the man she was now married to. The vintage dress I was wearing suddenly felt like armor, not because it protected me from her words, but because it represented everything she didn't understand about real value. She saw secondhand clothing and assumed poverty or poor judgment, but I was wearing a piece of fashion history that had been lovingly preserved and skillfully restored. She saw budget constraints and assumed inferiority, but I saw creativity and sustainability and appreciation for craftsmanship that transcended commercial trends. More importantly, I realized that this moment wasn't really about me at all. It was about Brittany's need to publicly establish her dominance over someone she perceived as competition, even though that competition existed entirely in her own mind. She needed the assembled guests to witness her superiority, to see that Ryan had upgraded from someone who shopped at estate sales to someone who could afford designer gowns and country club weddings. The realization was both liberating and deeply sad. Liberating because it freed me from any need to defend myself against someone whose opinion had no bearing on my actual worth or happiness. Sad because it revealed how little joy Brittany was, able to find in her own considerable advantages, how she needed to create conflict and competition even at her own wedding celebration. I looked around at the faces surrounding us, seeing a mixture of discomfort, anticipation, and in some cases, genuine sympathy for my position. These were Ryan's colleagues and friends, people who had known me during our marriage and could judge, for themselves, whether Brittany's characterization of me was accurate or fair. They could see that I was dressed appropriately and behaving with dignity, that I had responded to provocation with grace rather than escalation. Then I looked at Brittany, really looked at her, and saw something that surprised me. Beneath the perfectly applied makeup and the confident posture, I could see uncertainty and fear. She was performing confidence, but she wasn't feeling it. This public attack on me wasn't coming from a position of strength, but from deep insecurity about her own position and worth. She needed to tear me down because she was afraid that my mere presence somehow diminished her triumph. Understanding that shifted everything about how I wanted to respond. I didn't want to engage in a battle with someone who was clearly fighting ghosts rather than actual threats. I didn't want to give the assembled crowd the spectacle they seemed to be anticipating. I didn't want to allow this moment to become the story people told about Ryan's wedding, overshadowing what should have been a celebration of his happiness. Instead of defending myself or attacking back, I made a choice that surprised everyone present, possibly including myself. I stepped closer to Brittany, close enough that my voice wouldn't carry to the entire crowd, and spoke quietly enough that only she and perhaps her immediate bridesmaids could hear my words. "Brittany," I said, gently, "you look absolutely beautiful today, and Ryan seems very happy. I hope you both have a wonderful marriage." The words were sincere, delivered without sarcasm or hidden meaning. Then I stepped back and spoke more loudly, addressing the gathered crowd as much as the bride. "Thank you so much for including me in this celebration. It's been lovely to see everyone." The response clearly wasn't what anyone had expected, least of all Brittany herself. She'd been building toward what was probably intended to be a more devastating attack, something that would leave me visibly upset or struggling to maintain composure. Instead, I'd responded to her cruelty with kindness, her public insults with private grace, her attempt to humiliate me with genuine well-wishes for her happiness. The gathered crowd seemed uncertain how to react to this unexpected turn. Some people looked disappointed that the drama had fizzled rather than escalating into a more spectacular confrontation. Others appeared relieved that the uncomfortable situation was being resolved without further damage to anyone involved. Lisa looked proud, but also slightly concerned, probably wondering if my gracious response indicated that I was more hurt than I was letting on. But Brittany herself looked the most confused of all. She'd invested significant energy in constructing this public confrontation, carefully building up to what was supposed to be a moment of complete social triumph over her husband's ex-wife. Instead, she found herself in the position of having publicly insulted someone who had responded with nothing but kindness and appropriate wedding wishes. The silence stretched for several uncomfortable seconds as Brittany seemed to struggle with how to respond to my unexpected reaction. She'd prepared for defensiveness, anger, or embarrassment, any of which would have allowed her to continue her attack or graciously accept an apology. She hadn't prepared for genuine grace, and it left her without a clear script to follow. Finally, she managed a tight smile and said, "Well, thank you for coming. in a tone that suggested the conversation was over and I should probably take the hint and leave. But her voice lacked the confident cruelty of her previous comments, and she seemed diminished somehow by my refusal to engage in the battle she'd been trying to provoke. I nodded politely and began to turn away from the group, planning to find Lisa and perhaps suggest that we make our exit before any further complications could develop. The crowd around us started to disperse as people realized that the show was over and there wouldn't be any more dramatic developments to observe. Servers resumed their circulation with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and conversations gradually returned to more appropriate wedding reception topics. But as I took my first step away from the confrontation, something happened that no one in that circle could have anticipated. A woman I didn't recognize approached our group from the direction of the club's main entrance, walking with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had something important to accomplish. She was impeccably dressed in a way that spoke of serious professional authority, her silver hair styled in a chic bob, and her black jacket cut with the kind of precision that indicated either exceptional taste or significant expense. She was followed by a man carrying professional camera equipment, the kind of high-end gear that suggested commercial rather than personal photography. As they approached, I could see that several other guests were turning to watch their progress across the terrace, clearly curious about who these newcomers were and why they seemed so focused on our particular corner of the reception. When the woman reached our group, she looked directly at me with an expression of genuine excitement that seemed completely at odds with the social tension that had been dominating our corner of the terrace. "Excuse me," she said with a slight accent that sounded European but was difficult to place precisely. "I'm Isabella Marchetti from Vogue magazine. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I simply had to ask about your dress." The words seemed to hang in the air like something from a dream or a particularly elaborate practical joke. Vogue magazine? Here? Now? In the middle of what had just been a very public attempt to humiliate me for wearing a secondhand dress to a fancy wedding? The timing was so perfectly ironic that it felt like something from a romantic comedy rather than real life. The moment Isabella Marchetti introduced herself, everything on the terrace seemed to freeze in a tableau of shock and confusion. Brittany's face went through a series of rapid transformations, from the tight satisfaction of someone who had just delivered what she thought was a social coup de grace, to bewilderment, to something approaching panic as she began to process the implications of having a Vogue editor praising the very dress she had just spent several minutes publicly mocking. The bridesmaids flanking her looked equally stunned, their carefully composed expressions of superior amusement dissolving into uncertainty as they tried to understand how their coordinated attack on my secondhand attire had suddenly been interrupted by one of the fashion world's most respected authorities expressing admiration for the very garment they had just finished deriding. The other wedding guests who had gathered to observe our confrontation now found themselves witnessing something far more unexpected than the social drama they had been anticipating. Isabella seemed oblivious to the tension she had interrupted. Her attention focused entirely on my dress, with the kind of professional excitement that suggested she had discovered something genuinely remarkable. Her photographer companion was already assessing lighting conditions and angles, clearly prepared to begin working immediately if given permission. The whole situation felt surreal, like stepping into an alternate reality where the rules of social interaction had been completely rewritten. I found myself struggling to process what was happening, my mind still partially focused on managing the emotional aftermath of Brittany's public attack, while simultaneously trying to understand why a fashion magazine editor was expressing interest in my estate sale discovery. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, requiring me to shift gears completely from defensive social navigation to professional conversation with someone whose expertise I genuinely respected. But even as I struggled to adjust to this unexpected development, I was acutely aware that my response to Isabella's interest would be observed and analyzed by everyone present, particularly by Brittany and her supporters who had just finished explaining to the assembled crowd why my fashion choices were inappropriate for their social circle. Whatever I said, and how I said it would become part of the story these people told about this wedding for years to come. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. For the past several minutes, I had been subjected to increasingly pointed comments about my inability to afford appropriate attire for high-end social events, suggestions that my secondhand shopping represented some combination of poverty and poor judgment that made me unsuitable for inclusion in their elevated social circle. Now, suddenly, my supposedly inappropriate dress was being praised by someone whose professional opinion carried more weight in fashion circles than all of their designer purchases combined. I could see Brittany struggling to recalibrate her understanding of the situation, her eyes moving between Isabella's obvious authority and expertise and the vintage dress she had just finished dismissing as evidence of my social and economic inadequacy. The bridesmaids looked similarly confused, clearly uncertain whether they should continue supporting their friend's narrative about my fashion failures or begin backtracking in light of this new professional validation. The broader crowd of wedding guests was watching with the kind of fascinated attention that people bring to unexpected plot twists in stories they thought they understood. Many of them had just witnessed what they assumed was a fairly standard display of social hierarchy, with the wealthy new wife establishing her superiority over the ex-wife who clearly couldn't afford to compete in their luxury-focused world. Now they were seeing that narrative completely subverted by an outside authority they couldn't dismiss or diminish. Isabella's enthusiasm was genuine and infectious. Her professional excitement about discovering something special, creating an energy that cut through the social tension like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She moved closer to examine the beadwork more carefully, making appreciative sounds about the craftsmanship and construction details that most people would never notice. Her photographer began taking preliminary shots from various angles, clearly documenting what they had found for potential future use. As I watched Isabella's professional assessment of my dress, I felt a profound sense of vindication that had nothing to do with winning some kind of social competition with Brittany. Instead, it was the satisfaction of having my own judgment validated by someone whose expertise I respected. Confirmation that my appreciation for quality craftsmanship and timeless design was grounded in genuine understanding rather than self-deception, or rationalization of limited financial resources. The vintage dress had appealed to me not because it was inexpensive, but because it was beautiful. Not because I couldn't afford contemporary fashion, but because I preferred the superior construction and unique character of well-preserved historical pieces. Isabella's photographer captured the perfect shot, just as I smiled genuinely at Brittany's stunned expression. The Vogue editor was practically vibrating with excitement about featuring my vintage restoration story in their upcoming sustainable fashion spread. Brittany stood frozen, her earlier confidence shattered like expensive crystal hitting concrete. The gathered wedding guests whispered among themselves, clearly recognizing they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Within minutes, Isabella had my contact information and was discussing photo shoot details for their magazine feature. The irony was delicious, but I felt no need to gloat. Brittany's public humiliation of my cheap dress had backfired spectacularly, but revenge wasn't what I wanted. Instead, I graciously thanked her for including me in such a beautiful celebration, watching her face soften with what might have been genuine remorse. 3 weeks later, my photograph appeared in Vogue with the headline, "Sustainable Elegance: The Art of Vintage Revival." The article celebrated women who created authentic style through creativity rather than credit cards. My inbox flooded with interview requests and collaboration offers. Even Brittany sent a brief apology, acknowledging she'd been wrong about everything. The vintage dress taught me that real value isn't measured in price tags, but in vision, skill, and the confidence to trust your own judgment. Sometimes the universe has perfect timing, ensuring that authenticity always wins over artifice, that grace triumphs over cruelty, and that true elegance can never be purchased, only earned through character. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.